Happy Memorial Day weekend. Happy Monday. Happy Tuesday if you're across the pond. I hope you're all doing well. We're on to week 7 of Tarkir. And in case you're new here, welcome. I do a best of 1, best of 3 meta review every Monday. So there is, of course, going to be some repetition. But every week I get somebody who says that they haven't seen me before and they appreciate what I do. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about the top 8 performing decks in Diamond and above. So Diamond and Mythic. According to a third-party Untapped tracker, and this is a way that I can remove my bias. But I've been playing Magic the Gathering for 30 years and hopefully can give you some insights into why we see the changes that we're seeing. And I will also cover some of the information like what's the cards to look for in your opening hand in case you're new, as well as some of just the matchups of how the meta is working in a rock, paper, scissors kind of way. So first up here in number 1, according to Untapped in Tier 1, is Mardu Aggro. And we kind of see this rotation of Azorius Omniscience, Rakdos Aggro, and Mardu Aggro throughout the weeks, right? So Mardu Aggro up in number 1 this week. And if we compare this one to week 6, we see that they dropped the 3rd copy of the Callous Sellsword and the 4 copies of the Sunbillow Verge, and kind of went back to the older build. So we've got 4 copies of the Feather of Flight, as well as just the 2 mountains and the 2 plains. If you are going to run the Sunbillow Verge, I think you should just run them as plains with upside. So I think you should remove 4 plains if you are going to run the Sunbillow Verge. Other than that, though, this plays exactly like Boros Auras, except for you have the Callous Sellsword, which you can then fling to get a turn 4 win more consistently. So the deck overall is favored against Izzet Prowess, since Izzet Prowess can struggle with the Sheltered by Ghosts and keeping up with the lifelink. And then it is also favored against Mono Red Aggro for the same reason, Rakdos Aggro for the same reason, and Boros Auras because you have the Callous Sellsword to kind of give you just a tiny little bit of an edge against your opponent. So it's almost a really favored coin flip, but it's still really close. It is a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience. The Callous Sellsword helps this be closer to a coin flip, because without the Callous Sellsword, Azorius Omniscience is favored against Boros Auras, and then it is weak to anything that has a heavy amount of interaction. So Mono Black Midrange, Esper Pixie, Mono Black Demons, and Jeskai Control. And the opening hand, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Optimistic Scavenger, and the Manifold Mouse. And its counterpart, Boros Auras, which is basically the exact same list, has no changes from week 6 and is number 2 in according to Untapped in Tier 1. And it is also favored against Izzet Prowess, Mono Red Aggro, and Rakdos Aggro, anything that can struggle with the Sheltered by Ghosts strategy. It's weak to Azorius Omniscience because it doesn't have the fling. It more consistently loses to Azorius Omniscience on turn 4. And then it is also weak to Mono Black Midrange, Esper Pixie, Jeskai Control, and Mono Black Demons, anything that has the interaction to blow up the Sheltered by Ghosts. The opening hand is the same. You're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Optimistic Scavenger, and the Manifold Mouse. And number 3 this week, according to Untapped in Tier 1, is Rakdos Aggro. And if they're all in the same tier, that just means that they are statistically comparable or have a similar standard deviation, or statistically comparable standard deviation. So this one has no changes from last week and is trying to more consistently win on turn 3. It is favored against Izzet Prowess, Mono Red Aggro, and Azorius Omniscience, anything that it can outrace by being the most aggro deck in the format. It is then weak to everything else. So it's good at destroying the most popular builds on the ladder, but then is weak to Mono Black Midrange, Esper Pixie, Mono Black Demons, anything that has the interaction to blow up the Slick Shot Show Off or whatever you're targeting with the Monstrous Rage or the Turn Inside Out. But then it's also weak to Boros Auras because it doesn't have any way to interact with the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then it's also weak to Jeskai Control, which is able to shut it down as well. So this one you're looking for Turn Inside Out, Heartfire Hero, the Monstrous Rage, or your Emberheart Challengers. Alright, number 4, according to Untapped, is Azorius Omniscience in Tier 2. This one is a little bit it's more heavily teched against, I think is its biggest problem, is that people are used to it now because it is one of the most popular strategies along with Izzet Prowess on the ladder. So if we compare this one to last week, we do finally see changes, thanks largely to Convert Go Blue, or CGB, who did an Azorius Omniscience list, and I think this is their list. So we're dropping a single Invasion of Arcavios, and just really quickly, the reason why we see a decrease in the amount of Invasion of Arcavios is largely because in Best of 3, the Meringue River Regent loop allows us to have additional slots, right? It has stuff that we can, it allows us to drop the Invasion of Arcavios so that we can have more in our deck. Now, I'm not sure that I'm sold on it particularly. If you want to see my version of Azorius Omniscience, I did publish it a week ago. That leans more heavily into getting a turn 4 Omniscience. I like the fact that we brought in the Roiling Dragonstorms, but I don't like the fact that we cut the chart of course, right? So, everyone has their own opinions on this, and that's why I kind of try to remove my bias. But keep in mind that this one is also biased by CGB. So we dropped in a Darker Waste, the 2 Blast Zones, the Flagi Archaeologist, which is better against mono red, the Afara's Dispersal, which is also better against mono red, the 4 Chart of Course, which is then being replaced by the Roiling Dragonstorm as a way to get the Omniscience into the graveyard so that we can hit it with the Boilo's Awakening. And instead we're running just 2 islands. The 3 copies of Spell Pierce is kind of to reflect, similar to how in mono red or in mono black we're looking for duress instead of cut down. Because there's been a decrease in mono red and an increase in Azorius Omniscience, and especially in the higher ranks, it makes more sense to run the Spell Pierce to disrupt the Azorius Omniscience. If you're coming up against a lot of mono red though, then you're going to want to be running something like Afara's Dispersal instead. We also see a 4th copy of the Confounding Riddle, 4 Conduit Pylons as CGB's way of getting the Surveil land of choice, because it doesn't enter tapped. You could also run the rare land, that the Azorius rare land that surveils as well, but the downside to that one is that it is fully tapped instead of this one, in which you can tap for colorless mana. And we also got a Sea-Chromed Coast, the 4th copy of Stock Up, the 4 Meringue River Regents, and the 4 Roiling Dragonstorms. So this one isn't going for the enchantment mill loop with the Meringue River Regent, and instead is still leaning off of the Invasion of Arcavios as the win condition, which allows us to go grab Jeskai Revelation, which you only need 1 Invasion of Arcavios to be able to do the loop, which is partly why you can decrease the amount of Invasion of Arcavios in your deck. If you are, I think it's nice to have 3 for the consistency of digging into it, but it's also just personal preference. We also see that they dropped the Sunder the Gateway, which is kind of like the hope against the Ghost Vacuum. You could use like Into the Floodmaw to be able to bounce Rest in Peace or Ghost Vacuum, so that's the solution instead of Sunder the Gateway. Beseech the Mirror is no longer necessary because we don't need multiple copies of Invasion of Arcavios to do the This Town Ain't Big Enough loop. And then we also dropped the Season of Weaving, which is a way to bounce the entire board. And instead we're bringing in Split Up, and this one is a alternative Wrath to Day of Judgment, in case you need to play it out to solve, to stall the game before you're overrun. Typically, I don't find myself playing the Day of Judgment or the Split Up particularly that often in Best of 1, and I prefer to have things that can grab Invasion of Arcavios from the graveyard if you are doing the Jeskai Revelation loop, because if you mill both versions of Invasion of Arcavios, you're just kind of toast, right? So I like to get Cosmic Rebirth or something like that in the sideboard. But anyway, this match, this deck is favored against the Mono Black Midrange, Esper Pixie, Jeskai Control, any deck that is prioritizing removal, struggles with the combo strategy, and then it's favored against Boros Auras or decks like that don't have removal, so like Selesnya Rabbits, anything that's lacking interaction. And then it's also favored against Mono Black Demons, which is basically Mono Black Midrange, but with some cards removed for some demons. It's a coin flip against Izzet Prowess and Mardu Aggro, both of which can win if they're on the play and you're on the draw. So that one kind of becomes a little bit more dependent on who's starting first. And then it's weak against Mono Red Aggro and Rakdos Aggro, which both consistently can win sooner than this strategy. Although Mono Red Aggro is really close to a coin flip. And then the opening hand, you're looking for the Omniscience. This allows any cards like Roiling Dragonstorm to be able to get it into the graveyard, as well as if you have multiple copies of Omniscience in your opening hand, then you can more readily, when you play a Boros Awakening and they go to kill the thing that you reanimated, the 1/1 flyer, you play a second Azorius Omniscience, and then that usually can help you solidify the combo. Let's see what else. Roiling Dragonstorm helps you get it into the graveyard, like Chart a Course used to. Abuelo's Awakening is the whole combo enabler in this deck, and then Spell Pierce works really well if you are running them in case you're up against the mirror match and you're on the draw. All right, number 5 here is Mono Red Aggro and is in Tier 2, which again just means that it's a standard deviation below the Tier 1 decks, but still very viable strategy. And once upon a time, Mono Red Aggro was everyone's biggest complaint, and is now actually kind of not the #1 popular deck, which is refreshing. If we compare this one to Week 6, we see that they dropped the 4 copies of Burst Lightning to bring in the 4 copies of Shock. This just is because this list is the World Championship deck and is a popular pick. If you're running the Burst Lightnings, it does give you a little bit of advantage over the Shocks, although it doesn't have a huge impact on the win rate of the deck. Again, I have a personal tweak to this deck that drops the Lightning Strikes and the Witchstalker Frenzies, because I think this is more geared towards best of 3 than it is for best of 1, but they're minor changes. So this deck is favored against the Izzet Prowess and Azorius Omniscience, being able to outrace those 2 strategies. It's a coin flip against Esper Pixie and Mono Black Demons, which both have less interaction than the Mono Black Midrange deck. So you can kind of, if you're lucky to draw your threats and not your combat tricks, you can sometimes survive long enough to be able to beat those 2 strategies. And then again, it also depends on who has the play. If Mono Red has the play, it's a pretty hard curve out to answer a lot of the times. And then Mono Black Midrange, though, is more consistently able to shut down the strategy. Rakdos Aggro is more consistently able to race this strategy and win a turn sooner because of the fling. It's also weak to Jeskai Control, which is really set up to affect creature-centric strategies. So is good against Jeskai Control is good against Mono Red Aggro and Izzet Prowess. And then it's weak against Boros Auras, unless you're able to land the Shock against the Sheltered by Ghosts or the Burst Lightning. So the opening hand, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Manifold Mouse, the Hired Claw, and Monstrous Rage. Number 6 in Tier 2 is Esper Pixies, and if we compare this one to last week, we see that we dropped a single Plains to bring in a single Swamp. And I think that, since you don't really want a turn 1 Nurturing Pixie, the Hopeless Nightmare is a better turn 1. So I like the tweak of getting the 1 additional land or swamp in. So this deck is favored against anything that's weak against interaction. So favored against Boros Auras, Rakdos Aggro, and Mardu Aggro. It's especially because the Nowhere to Run is a great answer to the Sheltered by Ghosts as well as the Shard Mage's Rescue. It's a coin flip against Izzet Prowess. That one kind of depending on whether or not they hit the Quarry Steel Cutter and whether or not you're able to hate on their hand well enough to shut down their strategy before they go wide. It's also a coin flip against Mono Red Aggro, again, kind of depending on whether or not they are on the play and how your removal lines up against what they're drawing. The Sheltered by Ghosts, though, does help against the Mono Red Aggro matchup. And then it's a coin flip against Mono Black Midrange, which is just kind of a removal fest. Same with the Mono Black Demons, who has the removal at the right time. And then it's weak to Azorius Omniscience, having really no great way of interacting with that combo strategy. And it's also weak to Jeskai Control, which is able to shut down this deck. So the opening hand, you're looking for your 1-drops, so your Storm Chaser's Talent, your Hopeless Nightmare, your Nurturing Pixie, and your Optimistic Scavenger are all really great cards to have in your opening hand. Number 7 is Selesnya Rabbits, and if we compare this one, I believe we have to go back to Week 3 of Tarkir, but we do see some significant changes to the archetype, and I can't remember who it was in chat who was talking about it in the YouTube comments, was talking about how I thought Keen-Eyed Curator was positioned, and I think it's pretty good, right? I mean, it helps it helps this deck have an answer against Azorius Omniscience, which this deck is usually weak to because of no other way of interacting with the graveyard. So this I like the addition of the Keen-Eyed Curator, especially if you're in an Azorius Omniscience heavy meta. So if we compare to week 6, or sorry, week 3, we see the Cavern of Souls got dropped one. We dropped the two copies of the Sanguine Evangelist. We still have a third one. We're dropping both copies of the Phineas Ace Archer, 3 planes, all copies of the Seasoned Wearing Guard, as well as 2 copies of the Warren Warleader, and 2 forests. And instead, we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Keen-Eyed Curator as a way to hate on the graveyard, 4 copies of the Hushwood Verge, which is basically like a forest with upside. And then we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts, and I like the addition of the Sheltered by Ghosts in Selesnya Rabbits. As again I mentioned, I have my own builds of these decks, which are available if you want to go find the video. But this helps improve against the matchup against mono red aggro. And then it has 4 copies of Hinterland Sanctifier, which also helps out against mono red aggro. So this deck, for the most part, depends on what build you're running, right? But this one, the strategy tends to be favored against Izzet Prowess, being a go-wide strategy like Izzet Prowess, but with the life gain of Sheltered by Ghosts, which the deck can, Izzet Prowess can struggle against. It's also favored against mono black midrange, which so Boros Auras is not, because it's more heavily into building a single thing with Sheltered by Ghosts, whereas the oh, there's still 1 copy of Phineas Ace Archer. I apologize. So this one is trying to go wide, and that the go wide strategies like Izzet Prowess punish mono black midrange, which is trying to answer things 1 for 1. So the more that you're flooding the board, it's more difficult for cards that are, or for decks that are trying to control the board, like mono black midrange and Esper Pixie, to be able to do that. So it's favored against Esper Pixie and mono black demons and mono black midrange for that reason. It's a coin flip against mono red aggro. Depending on who's going first, and depending about whether or not you're running the Sheltered by Ghosts. If you're not running the Sheltered by Ghosts, then mono red aggro starts to look quite a bit more favored against this archetype. And then it is weak against Azorius Omniscience. Again, Keen-Eyed Curator does help that matchup. And then it's weak to Rakdos Aggro. And looking at this list, you're going to be weak against Rakdos Aggro unless you get a Sheltered by Ghosts that kind of just runs away with the game, because you have no instant speed interaction to shoot the Slickshot Show-Off out of the air. And then you've got, it's weak against Boros Auras for a similar reason. You're not going to be able to disrupt their Sheltered by Ghosts. And then it's weak against Jeskai Control, which is good at, this is the one answer in the one controlling archetype right now that's good at answering the board flood strategies of Izzet Prowess and Selesnya Rabbits. With the sweepers and the temporary lockdowns, Jeskai Control is where you want to be if that's your jam. In the opening hand, you're looking for the Valley Might Caller. This card gets huge in this archetype, and then the Pop Hatch Recruit is a nice one to have as well that protects your Valley Might Caller, or gives you I guess a +1/+1 counter if it's removed. Phineas Ace Archer, if you are running, especially if you're running all 3, it's a good one to have in your mulligan strategy. You're also looking for the Valley Quest Caller as a lord, and then if you are running it, the Sheltered by Ghosts is also nice to have in your opening hand. All right, and last but not least, in number 8, also in tier 2, is mono black midrange. And if you go and look at my video about all the decks that I love in Standard, there are 20 viable strategies to take to Mythic. So these are just the top 8, and this one has no changes from week 6. So deciding to run the Mishra's Foundry over the Soulstone Sanctuary, deciding to run 2 copies of Liliana. It's usually whether or not we see 25 or 24 lands, kind of the things that we see throughout the weeks. This strategy is good against anything that's weak against interaction, so mono red aggro, Rakdos Aggro, and Boros Auras. It's a coin flip against Izzet Prowess, again, whether or not they hit the Quarry Steelcutter, and anything Esper Pixie, Mono Black Demons, and Jeskai Control is just kind of who draws the removal at the right time. And then it's weak against Azorius Omniscience, not really having a great way to shut down that combo or hit on attack the graveyard outside of running something like Soul Guide Lantern. So, your opening hand, you're looking for the Unstoppable Slasher, the Duress, Unholy Annex, and Deep Cavern Bat. And again, this kind of showcases how popular Azorius Omniscience is. If you're coming up against a lot of mono red, you would look for Cutdown instead of Duress. Alright, and now for best of 3. So every week I like to also cover what happened over the weekend in the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, which is a pretty good competitive tournament to kind of keep track of what's happening in Best of 3. Now, if you want a more full meta analysis of what's happening in Best of 3, I highly recommend the MTG Rebellion. They do a Best of 3 specific kind of meta review every week, and I'm a big fan of it. This is also gives me a kind of just an opportunity to share my knowledge of what's happening in Best of 3. And so Izzet Prowess here by Hamuda. Izzet Prowess is a very popular deck, and three of the slots this week were taken up by Izzet Prowess, so it's performing quite well as well. And so this one took down first place on May 24th, and if we compare this one to last week's, the second version of it in Izzet Prowess, we can see that they dropped a single copy of the Drake Hatcher, they dropped a Mountain, they dropped all 4 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, and they dropped 3 copies of the Burst Lightning. And so the upside to running the Burst Lightning is if they're running something like the Slickshot Show-Off, you're able to more readily shoot it out of the air. The Monastery Swiftspear then increasing the aggressiveness of the deck, and then the Drake Hatcher really depends on how much Izzet Prowess you're coming up against. This card is really nice in the mirror match. So the Muda here deciding to bring in a Braid, which is a good counter to the Quarry Steelcutter, bringing in a Spell Pierce, which helps out against cards, like Azorius Omniscience. There are some things where the Spell Pierce lines up pretty nicely. Also prevents your deck, your board from just getting completely wiped by a temporary lockdown. The third copy of the Torch the Tower helps the deck have a little bit of interaction. And we're bringing in 1 copy of this Town Ain't Big Enough. As you'll see, some lists run more of this, kind of giving you a little bit more mid-range loops that you can do off of the Storm Chaser's talent. So depending on how, you can kind of dial in how aggressive or the tempo of this deck. So the more this Town Ain't Big Enough's, the slower the tempo, the grindier it is off of the Storm Chaser's talent. And then we're also bringing in an island. The Best of 3 sideboard also got a rework, so we dropped 1 copy of the Ral Crackling Wit, which is good against the white sweepers, 1 Sunspine Lynx, which is good against Esper, Pixie, and Domain. Let's see here. We've also dropped a Torch the Tower, which is in the main. We've dropped an Eddie Merc Crab, which is the kind of the tempo version of this, where you can kind of bring in a mid-range threat. We saw the Tolarian Terror and the Eddie Merc Crab being explored early on in Tarkir. And we see that the 2 Slickshot Show-Offs have been moved from the sideboard and started in the main. I kind of liked it in the sideboard, where you're like, okay, well, if they're not running the Torch the Towers and the Burst Lightnings, then you can bring in the Slickshots. But this one, just deciding to start them in the main. And then taking out the Unable to Screams. And the Unable to Screams were in here as a way to answer opponents having something like the Screaming Nemesis, which is more readily able to block up the ground against the Drake Hatchers. And instead, we're bringing in an additional copy of Spell Pierce if you're up against a control matchup or a combo matchup where the Spell Pierce is nice. Negate as well. And then we've got the 2 copies of Rebel Salvo. And this is kind of an alternative to the Witchstalker Frenzy. So you're able to deal 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker. It gets cheaper if you have your Quarry Steelcutter. The creatures lose indestructible if that is relevant. But we still have 1 copy of the Witchstalker Frenzy, which I'm not sold on it over the Rebel Salvo just personally. But the Witchstalker Frenzies are kind of left over from when we used to see the Screaming Nemesis as a sideboard option against other mono-red decks. And then we have Tishana's Tidebinder, which is a way to kind of silence planeswalkers like Ral, but also able to silence things like Quarry Steelcutter. Anything that has a triggered ability is a pretty decent target for the Tishana's Tidebinder. But you have to be a little bit careful, because if it's an aggro strategy, then the 3/2 body doesn't block particularly well. And then we have Enduring Curiosity, and this one is seeing more play as a sideboard option to give the card a little bit, or give the deck a little bit more refueling capability. So we're going to see this one in several lists, or at least 2 of the lists this week. And then we have the 4th copy of the Drake Hatcher in the sideboard if it turns out to be a good matchup, like the mirror match, to bring it in. Second place on May 24th was Rakdos Midrange by Owl 1013. And we've seen Rakdos Midrange long ago, and it's been a while. It's been a bit. But it does me good to see it come back. and it's basically mono black mid-range with red for a little bit of interaction with the Torch, the Tower, and the Abrade. But then also the Fear of Missing Out and the Tursa to give us some hand smoothing to kind of help us filter out our bad cards to draw our lands and such, but then also to enable Delirium and allow us to attack with a creature 2 times in one combat phase. Works particularly well with the Giant Archfiend of the Dross. Shield of the Apocalypse is pretty well positioned in the meta right now to punish the card draw off of Izzet Prowess. Karsi Revenant gives us some life stabilization with the lifelink and is kind of a difficult threat that can give us value off of discarding it with the Tursa Light Shatter or the Fear of Missing Out. Preacher of the Schism also helps slow things down against the aggro matchups. We've got the classic removal of Cut Down as well as Go for the Throat and Anoint with Affliction. Dreams of Steel and Oil allows us to target the Quarry Steel Cutter as well, and then same with the Duress, but Duress then being a little bit more geared specifically towards cards like or decks like the Azorius Omniscience deck, and then Archfiend of the Dross works well with the Unholy Annex, Shield of the Apocalypse as well. But because we're bringing in the second color, we're leaning a little bit further away from the double pit black cards, still including a fair amount though. Gix's Command is a nice sweeper, gives us lifelink as well, can be used, has a lot of versatility, and then Harvester of Misery is a pretty good one to wipe the board against the go wide strategies. So the best of 3 sideboard, we have Ghost Vacuum to give us Graveyard Hate. Liliana of the Veil is really nice against other control matchups. It's also good against like mid-range strategies that have like a single big threat like the Archfiend of the Dross. If you are coming up against something like that, it's less well positioned against the go wide strategies like Izzet Prowess. But we've got the Brotherhood's End for that as the kind of cheap sweeper. Also destroys all artifacts with mana value 3 or less, which can be relevant in some matches. Chandra, the Spark Hunter, is a really great one if you're coming up against another control matchup that has a lot of creature hate, because the Planeswalkers get around Wraths. And then the fact that it creates the vehicle tokens too kind of helps with the Wraths. Another copy of Dreams of Steel and Oil if you are really wanting to lean on hating on the Izzet Prowess, which with how prevalent Izzet Prowess is not a bad strategy. Lithomantic Barrage helps out against Jeskai Oculus or Zur to some extent. Any white or blue strategy, Esper Pixie. Anoint with Affliction, you've got for any problematic 3 or less thing that's sticky and annoying. You've got a Braid for Artifact Hate, Sunspine Links for Esper and Domain, Gix's Command for a secondary sweeper, and then you've got the other 2 copies of an Unholy Annex if you aren't up against an aggro strategy that's going to punish the life loss. I guess actually I should clarify that some people actually like to bring in the Unholy Annex against mono red aggro specifically. If they struggle to answer the 6/6 flyer and you're gaining life drawing cards and zapping your opponent, it can actually be a stabilizing force in mono red. So it's worse off in archetypes though that generally if your life total is at risk and they have the removal, Unholy Annex can be bad. So see here. So there's another tournament as well on the 24th, and that was taken down by Izzet Prowess by Pepetine. And if we compare this one, it's also closest to last week's list, the second version. So we dropped 1 copy of the Monastery Swiftspear instead of all 4. Dropped 2 copies of Into the Floodmaw. Dropped a single Drake Hatcher and a Mountain, as well as 3 copies of Monstrous Rage. So instead of the Burst Lightnings, we're going for the Combat Tricks. And so you can kind of see, like, you're either playing the interaction to shoot the Slickshot Show-Offs down, or you're playing the combat tricks, which are weaker to the interaction, right? And then we've also... So we're bringing in the Torch the Tower, an additional copy of Torch the Tower. This one's leaning more into the late-game strategy of looping this town big enough with the Storm Chaser's talent. And then we're also bringing in the Thunder Trap Trainer, which also helps us dig into that loop. And 2 islands, because it's a little bit more about looping blue spells over and over with this specific build than it is the Slickshot Show-Off. So this one's dropping a Lithomantic Barrage, the Edinburgh Crab, the 2 Slickshot Show-Offs, the Sunspine Links, the Unable to Screams, and instead it's bringing in Disdainful Stroke. This one is good to counter any spell that's 4 or greater, or bringing in a Negate. So like this one works as well against like the Zur Domain decks. We've got Negate for control decks, specifically 1 copy of Rebel Salvo for the kind of Witchstalker Frenzy effect. We've got the Enduring Curiosity for the mid-range or control matchups where you need additional resources or dig. And then we've got the Get Out, and this one we usually see in Dimir Bounce, but I kind of like it, right? Being able to be a cheap way to do this town ain't big enough. The only downside being the double pip blue, but this one is more heavily blue because we're bringing the Enduring Curiosity anyway, right? So I kind of like this inclusion here. And then we've got the Roaring Furnace. This one we see sometimes as removal. It gives you a little bit more of like that mid-range dig where the Steaming Sauna can help if you're coming up against a lot of control. And we have seen an increase in the amount of control decks on the in the meta. And then we've got the fourth copy of the Drake Hatcher that we can bring in if it is a good matchup for it. All right, and then second place was taken down by Dimir Midrange. This one is kind of, we see this one as the second most commonly talked about in Tarkir has been Dimir Midrange. And so if we compare this one to week 6, we can see that they dropped a single Duress, the 2 copies of the Flood Pits Drowner, a Swamp, all 3 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat, and 2 copies of the Shield of the Apocalypse, 2 copies of the Fairy Dream Thief, which is the 1-costed black one that can surveil that we'll talk about. This one's leaning a little bit more towards the 2-drop unblockable to be able to then do the turn 3 ninjutsu off of Kaido, so it's less important to have the turn 1 off of the Dream Thief, which I think makes sense. And then we're also dropping 1 copy of the Intimidation Tactics. And Intimidation Tactics is the one that is the edict that exiles your opponent's graveyard, is a way to kind of hate on the Azorius Omniscience deck or the Jeskai Oculus deck, anything that cares about the graveyard. So instead we're bringing in a 4th copy of the Cutdown to attack aggro decks, same with the 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction. Bringing in the 2 copies of the Fairy Mastermind. This one is a nice one to have in the mirror match against other Dimir decks, but it's also good to have in the mirror match or in the Izzet Prowess decks because of how often they're able to draw. So you can kind of offset the advantage there with the Fairy Mastermind. We've got the full playset of the Preacher of the Schism to help out against aggro, and then we're bringing in the 3 copies of the Azure Beastbinder, and this is a particularly nice one I think to pair in combination with the Kaido, because we're leaning in. This one is fully bringing in all 4 playsets, or a full playset of Kaido Bane of Nightmares, and so because it's basically a unblockable to an extent. You turn, whenever this attacks up to 1 target artifact, creature, or planeswalker, loses all of its abilities. If it's a creature, it also has base power toughness 2/2 until your next turn. So when it attacks, you can just turn off their Quarry Steelcutter, and it just loses all abilities, right? And then you can then Kaido it, and it still has changed that it's turned off their Quarry Steelcutter while you're ninjutsu in the Kaido Bane of Nightmares, right? So kind of an interesting line, definitely one worth exploring. So we're also bringing in 2 additional Soulstone Sanctuaries, and then an island. And the best of 3 sideboard here, we've got 1 less Anoint with Affliction, 1 less Cut Down, both going into the main, 1 less Karsi Revenant, and that's the Lifelinker 3/3 Vampire. 2 Disdainful Strokes have been dropped, and the 2 Fairy Masterminds have been moved to the main. And instead we're bringing in a additional copy of Duress, and this helps out against the control matchups, anything that has a non-creature card that is very important. Shield of the Apocalypse, again, like I mentioned, is good against the Izzet Prowess decks. I would bring them in there because of punishing the draw. You've also got the 2 copies of Negate if you are coming up against a control matchup or Azorius Omniscience. And then Change the Equation is particularly nice to counter red or green spells. So if you're coming up against Izzet Prowess, the Change the Equation can work pretty well as well. But it also counters any spell with mana value 2 or less, so it also has additional applications elsewhere if they're playing something that's really important on turn 2 or 1. All right, and now for the standard challenge on May 25th. And so we see Orzhov Self-Bounce. We saw this one in week 5. If we compare it to that list, we see that they dropped a Beza. Oh, sorry, this one was by a Bioto and took down first place. We see that they dropped a Beza. We dropped a Go for the Throat. We dropped a Tiny Bones Joins Up and a decided to bring in the second copy of Shield of the Apocalypse. Again, well positioned against Izzet Prowess. Anoint with Affliction for removing problematic early threats. Excuse me. And then bringing in Get Lost. So, excuse me. All right, so we're bringing in the Get Lost. So basically, yeah, you're seeing it like Get Lost instead of Go for the Throat. Shield of the Apocalypse instead of Beza. And Tiny Bones joins up getting replaced for the Anoint with Affliction. And so relatively the same. Tiny Bones joins up was kind of included for the temporary lockdown loops as just an additional way to have like another Hopeless Nightmare. The whole point of this deck is to just replay your cool enchantments like Momentum Breaker, Nowhere to Run, and Hopeless Nightmare off of looping your temporary lockdowns. And the best of 3 sideboard here also got a rework, so we're dropping 1 Duress and the 2 Exercise, and the 2 Elendas. Elendas being the Orzhov thing that can only be targeted, or has hexproof against instance. Somebody pointed out to, I always say instance, and sorceries. And so we took out the Elenda. We're bringing in an additional copy of Beza. So we do have the Beza if we want to lean towards it. The upside is Shield of the Apocalypse is better against Izzet Prowess. Beza, the Bounding Spring, is better against just mono red aggro. But both stabilizing forces, mid-range stabilizing forces against aggro. And then we have the 2 copies of the Wiltleaf Liege, and this one being a good one to bring in against the mirror match or against Esper Pixie. If they're making you discard, then this is a good way to get a free creature onto the battlefield that is a little bit more castable in theory than just running the Baloth, which is the other all one that we see to punish the discard strategies. And then we have the Grim Bauble, which is sort of like the if you're really into, if they're really aggressive, if they're running the Heartfire Heroes and such like that, then you can bring in the Grim Bauble. Okay, so second place on Sunday, May 25th, was taken down by Izzet Prowess by Delver Fokero, and is the same list as Hamuda, so we won't cover that one, but do note that there was a fair amount of Izzet Prowess, even though I'm not showing all 3 lists. The other thing too, I want to just apologize. I am a mere mortal. I screwed up last week when I covered the RCQ, the qualifier, instead of the actual regional championship. So first place was taken down by Mono Red, and second place was taken down by Azorius Control. And I mentioned it in the comments, but I didn't actually have a chance to talk about those 2 decks. So we're going to compare this one to last week's winner of the second place in the regional championship in Hartford. And so Azorius Control is definitely coming back in a big way. I expect to see more of it as we go forward, and it's nice to see Elspeth Stormslayer, in a top archetype, because we knew it was going to get there, right? So this week we're dropping the 1 copy of Negate, we're dropping a Seachrome Coast, we're dropping a Get Lost, little nitpicky things here and there. We're dropping the 3 copies of the Split Up, because we're also dropping the Authority of the Consuls. Those work particularly well together. And then we're also dropping the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. And so this is not leaning towards a mill victory. And we're bringing in the Darker Waste, the 2 additional copies of the Temporary Lockdown, just leaning into this as the choice sweeper. Bringing in a Change the Equation in the main, as I mentioned, good against red and green strategies. Bringing in an additional No More Lies, as well as the 3 steps ahead, making it a little bit more fully controlling. And then if we're seeing more Azorius Control come in because of the regional championship, the more counterspells is usually the winner in the mirror match. So that's why we're seeing more counterspells being brought in my opinion. And then we also have the additional copy of Day of Judgment for Sweeper, Fountain Port for additional value off the tokens, because we're leaning more heavily into it by bringing in Elspeth Stormslayer at 2 copies. And I think I really like the inclusion of Elspeth here, because we're trying to win more fully off of the token strategies of Overlord of the Mistmores and such. So best of 3 sideboard, we're also seeing a fair amount of tweaks here. So we're dropping the 2 Stone Brains, and the Stone Brain is a way to hate on a combo specific strategy, so it's a good way to remove something like Omniscience. We're dropping 2 Change the Equations, because we moved 1 to the main getting rid of the other one in the sideboard. We're dropping in Elspeth's Smite, 1 Rest in Peace, which is the Graveyard Hate, and 1 No More Lies, because we moved it to the main. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of Destroy Evil. This is kind of like the exercise, but it can't target artifacts, but it attacks toughness instead, but it gives you some enchantment hate. I can't actually think of the top of my head what is a good target for the Destroy Evils. If you know in the comments below, help me out. What tech would you be bringing this in specifically against? Anyway, so we've also got 2 Tishana's Tidebinders. That one I do know. Again, it's good against things like Ral, things that are brought in to avoid your sweepers, like the temporary lockdowns. It's also good against turning off the Quarry Steelcutter. And we've got 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, which have been moved from the main to the sideboard as a way to mill if you are up against another controlling strategy. Wiltleaf Liege as a way to punish the discard strategies of Hopeless Nightmare, and then a 2nd copy of the Overlord of the Mistmoors if we need an additional kind of mid-range win condition. So, and then, as I mentioned, some strategies like Izzet Prowess really struggle against High Noon, which then just prohibits them from being able to cast multiple spells in one turn. And notably, I think I did forget to mention this during the... oh no, it's the next deck. Dude, man, this is a lot of work, man. So thank you, everybody, for being a part of it. All right, last but not least is Orzhov Midrange by Zyper TXT. And if we go back long ago, back into September during Duskmorn, we did see an Orzhov Midrange list that's basically mono black midrange. Legion to Ashes helps remove the go wide that mono black can struggle with, and that's why we typically see the Orzhov, but it also has a stronger sideboard than just strictly mono black. So this is a new archetype, sort of. We've got the Unholy Annex paired with the Archfiend of the Dross, Shieldred the Apocalypse to punish Izzet Prowess, Karsi Revenant for stabilization, Preacher of the Schism to help out against aggro, go for the Throat and Cut Down, and then we've got Deep Cavern Bat and Cruel Claws Heist as a way to hate on our opponent's hand, same with Duress, and then we are running the Intimidation Tactics as a way to have kind of a Hail Mary against the Azorius Omniscience deck. So it's basically mono black mid-range with a white for the sideboard, and technically it's Mardu because we're bringing in the 1 Blazemire Verge as a way to cast the red side of High Noon. So similar to the deck before it, High Noon is really good against Izzet Prowess. Exercise is what I was talking about, where it's the alternative to Destroy Evil. I'm not exactly sure why you would be running the Destroy Evil instead of the Exercise. Would be curious on your guys' thoughts on that. And then Caustic Bronco we haven't seen since the World Championship. It works well against the other like Dimir mid-range strategies. Like if you're up against something that's trying to answer you 1-for-1, then the Caustic Bronco can give you the additional cards to beat the strategies that are trying to answer 1-for-1. But it's not as good against the aggro decks where you don't necessarily have life for that strategy, but it does feel really great when you pop them for 8 with the Unholy Annex. Beza the Bounding Spring helps stabilize instead of the Shieldred the Apocalypse. Again, this one is, I think, better against the Izzet Prowess. Beza's generally better against something more specific to the like a mono red aggro strategy, in my opinion. Let's see, we've got the Cut Down for against aggro, Ghost Vacuum for Graveyard Hate, Pest Control for the Go Wide, kind of token hate, Lord Skitter as a way to give us some Graveyard Hate, Elspeth Stormslayer as a Planeswalker if we're up against something that's good at wiping the board, Gix's Command as an alternative sweeper, and then the 4th copy of the Unholy Annex if we aren't up against aggro, in my opinion. So, thanks for listening to my ramblings. As always, I hope they find you well. This will be my last video for quite some time. I will see you all again sometime in June. And sadly, I won't be able to do my typical breakdown for the up-and-coming set of Final Fantasy. So I'll be joining you kind of late into Final Fantasy to return back to business as usual. Thanks again to my YouTube members. This content is brought to you by viewers like you who have decided to support me as a YouTube member. So I appreciate it. Thank you. And good luck climbing the ladder and competing in your RCQs. If you have any questions or, feel free to leave comments below. I try to answer each one. So take care, everybody, and I will see you in about a month.